if you're not completely embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've probably launched too late.
Founder and CEO of the Discov.
So that the 200,000 that they invested was in itself a convertible loan agreement. Really fall in love with the problem and not the solution. We did expand to the wrong markets. Sometimes a problem is actually a symptom of another problem. I would advise not to go into business with a friend.
Today we have Kasper Baars, who's joining us today. Kasper has a roller coaster story to share with us about his time as founder and CEO of the Discov, which is a student university matchmaking platform that helped over 80,000 students find their dream university abroad. He'll tell us about his entrepreneurial journey, the challenges that came with scaling, the uprooting effects of changing government policy, the difficulty of balancing friend-co-founder relationship, which I think will be really interesting, managing failure, and more. Kasper, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, Kasper, let's start at the beginning of the company's journey. Where did the idea for the Discov come from, and how did you and your co-founder meet?
Sure. So the idea for the Discov actually came from, our personal experiences, both of me and my co-founders as international students trying to make the right, educational decisions along our journey. So we met about 11 years ago now in an international boarding school in Eswatini, or some might know it as Swaziland, in Southern Africa, where we both did an IB diploma, International Baccalaureate. And we both had ambitions to study abroad. For him, that was the Netherlands. For me, that was the UK. But we both really struggled to have an understanding of what we actually wanted to study, I'm sure like many, and also what would actually be the right fit for us in terms of the program and in terms of, the university. So a lot of our research, we of course had to do online, being like that far away from our dream study destinations. And a lot of the information we could find was, we've both found very heavy, very focused on academics, based on like what you're going to study, maybe something about like what the assessment looked like. And if you're lucky, you might have a sense of what sort of learning outcomes you might get, and which professors might be involved in teaching you. But it was very hard to actually form a picture of where we would actually spend the next 3-4 years of our lives and what we would actually get out of our study experience, both academically but also otherwise. So I ended up going to Manchester University, which was for my bachelor's, which was a great fit for me, but it very much felt like a pretty big leap of faith. I didn't really know much what to expect before getting there. I'd been once to the UK in London, but I can't say I was very familiar with what it was like living and studying in the UK. And again, like I said, I was very lucky because actually the program, the university, the city, it matched me in a lot of ways. But I saw that a lot of my fellow students, especially the ones coming from a lot further, actually had no idea what they were getting into, apart from, let's say, like cultural differences and stuff like that. For many, it was the first time even visiting the UK or being in the UK. And for some, that turned out okay, just like me. But for others, they found out that actually it wasn't a very good fit for them.
Do you have an example or an example story of someone that found that it just really wasn't a fit for them for whatever reason, whether that was academic, cultural, or social?
Yeah, I do actually. Both in my own experience, there was a student in my class who was from Nigeria, and he had come to the university through a study agent that had helped him to get a place. And he, after the first few months of studying politics, because I did a bachelor's in European studies and Portuguese, which is a very sort of social science based study, found out that he actually didn't find the course content like that relevant for him. And he also really struggled on sort of a cultural fit. Like he struggled to really, find friends to connect to, really form a bit of a student social life around it as well. And especially as an international student, his parents, who had financed his studies, had paid so much for him to study there that he felt like there was so much riding on it that he could not, change his mind or change course, or, he load up another, 18,000, I think, at the time for an international student per year. So we decided to just continue and stick with it and try to finish it. But he struggled really mentally as well, to be able to do that. So at least he finished, but of course there was also students who decided to change and or even drop out or figure that university wasn't quite right for them, even though it might have been, but in a different course or in a different university, it could have looked much different. So yeah, based on this, and Rohan, my co-founder, who studied at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, saw very similar things happening at his university and found that a lot of his fellow students were also struggling. So when we finished our degrees, we didn't start the idea straight away. I actually worked as a marketing consultant for a couple of years at a consultancy in Amsterdam. Yeah, so after a few years consulting on the sidelines myself, I decided I wanted to do something entrepreneurial myself. But I had only studied social science. I didn't really have a business background, so I decided to do a master's in international business. And around the time that I finished, we were speaking to each other, and we still had this idea that there should be a better way to help students find their make a better student university fit. Right. So we decided we still had this idea, and we decided to really do well to pick it up to really make a better student university fit. One of the things we saw at the time, you already had booking.com, which is, great if you just wanted to book a holiday for a weekend or go out somewhere. You had all these resources to make, to make your choice, like based on reviews of guests that had stayed there. You have all the information on like the location, what you can do around it. But there's actually nothing like that as a student when you're going to study for, 3, 4 years in another country. So that's where the idea sort of came from. So we decided to do a lot more research into this. We decided to interview, in total, I think it was around 700 prospective and current as well as past international students on how they experienced their orientation journey to university and what they wish they would have known before making this choice. And with this research, we started to build on the Discov. What that looked like initially is we were fortunate enough to be accepted into like a startup studio acceleration program in the Netherlands, which meant that we could pitch our idea based on the research that we did and then get not only an investment, but also a lot of mentorship and guidance from, seasoned entrepreneurs within the startup studio to take the idea from the ideation stage to actual like proof of concept. So with both funding and guidance.
What did the application process look like for this accelerator? What kind of stages did you have to go through?
So the first stage is in the first stage you would actually it was like co-founder matching. So we actually came in as friends, so we knew we wanted to do this together. But if we would have applied through the normal channels, let's say, or if we would have done it the normal way, actually the first step is that you get matched to a co-founder who matches you or complements you in terms of skills and background and experience and stuff like that before you then go into ideation. And that's where you really focus on finding a problem. So finding a problem that you have a passion about, that you might have some experience with, and that is sort of acute enough to be able to build an idea around. And once you have a vague idea of that, you go into discovery. And discovery is all about doing the market research to validate the problem, to do problem interviews, to do solution interviews. So this is where you actually start, giving form to your business model. Now, once you have that, then you would actually be able to pitch something. And based on the pitch, if you get accepted, then they would offer you a 200K euros investment, which would be tranched. So it would be cut up in 4 tranches, and every sort of milestone or stage would unlock a new tranche based on what you were able to achieve, and based on that you could keep investing, you could keep growing, you could keep building essentially. So that's what the program looked like. Yeah.
And does
Um,
the accelerator themselves, how much of a cut do they take from the overall business?
it was quite steep. So they had a 25% stake in our company.
Mm.
So before we even had from day one essentially. And then the investment that they made, so that the 200,000 that they invested was in itself a convertible loan agreement. So that would then be converted into equity over time, or if you would raise your next round. So that's what the deal looked like, which is a lot of startup founders would say would not probably take that deal, or it's quite steep in terms of equity that you have to give away. But on the other hand, they are very focused on, let's say, graduate founders without, entrepreneurial experience, without funding, without, a huge network. So there is a lot that they invest into training you as a founder as well, which they would say is what makes up part of the investment as well. So once we raised that, then we started to build a prototype of the product. We launched this in February 2021. We initially had focused on students as our customers, and at this point, what the product looked like is that we would give personalized advice to students based on an assessment of their background, their interests, their personality, their student life preferences, their budget situation. So taking into all of those factors and then writing a personalized advice based on a calculation model that we made and based on data that we collected from universities in the Netherlands at the time on what would be the best fitting universities for them, looking at the facilities they had available, how other students had reviewed their program or their university experience based on things like cost of living data in different places, but also the wider environment around it. So not just the university, but looking at the city as well. It would really look at things like, also sports interests, arts and culture, nightlife options, diversity within the classroom, within the university. So really try to make it as, holistic picture as possible. And then essentially just handwrite reports for students and then sell them for a price, for one price, which worked quite well in the beginning. At least we managed to sell a few. But then as we realized that the channels, or that channel, wasn't very scalable to be able to, to have to do one-on-one consultative sales, essentially to sell one report for $100 at the time. So when we tried to really start selling the product from a like digital marketing perspective, building a landing page, having a payment system in there, we realized that we couldn't really sell anything anymore. We tried to iterate the process many ways, working with like a free demo report as a step up to a more, full personal study advice. But eventually we decided to pivot as we also did more research. We also found out that this wasn't just a student problem, it was also very much a university problem, being able to attract well-fitting candidates that would not only have a high chance of, applying, but also really enrolling and being successful within their time at university. So not dropping out, getting good grades, stuff like that. So eventually we decided to pivot towards the university as our customer and looking at students more as our users, and then built a business model around that. Um, so when we launched in February 2021, we got our first 10 pilot customers, so university customers in the Netherlands in that year, which was very lucky actually that we had so many that wanted to trial the product with us. I think the fact that we were doing research on a lot of them helped to, establish that relationship and, invite them as visionary customers to be able to contribute to its development. And then, yeah.
Question on that:
Hmm.
universities. I think a lot of people would think of them as a big often faceless organization. How do you, one, get a foot in the door to get them to start speaking to you? And then two, how do you figure out who is the decision maker who's actually going to sign off on the bill?
Hmm. So it wasn't easy getting our foot in the door. They are big organizations that are complex, often bureaucratic. Um, Sometimes I would say conservative. They're not like normal companies. They are, for a large part, publicly funded. They are, they don't operate, with the same sort of goals and strategies that, big corporates might operate as. They're delivering education, and that's something else than, delivering, a more like a different consumer product in that sense. So what we initially went for was trying to go in. Our assumption was, well, we need to go in as high as possible because then we'll have the biggest chance of testing it like across the whole university. Then we quickly learned that that was not going to be a very successful strategy because as a small, fledgling startup with like a vague idea, not really a fully worked out and validated product, they were not going to waste their time on it. So eventually we decided to try go for a more bottom-up approach. So we decided to reach out to individual faculties and heads of recruitment and marketing people within those faculties who would often have a little bit of budget, obviously not as big of a budget as a central university might have, but a little bit of budget to, play around, try new things and promote like their faculty and their programs. And that worked out a lot better. So initially most of our first pilot customers were individual faculties at universities. And we're not talking big numbers here, right? Where it was very much like an MVP in a pilot project where I think a contract on average might have been less than 3,000 euros or so for a first year. So, but it did allow us to at least test the product in a live environment to be able to get feedback from our customers to start really that iterative building process. So that was really helpful. And then once we managed to actually successfully close a few of these pilots, of course, not all are successful, but that's, I guess, the idea of a pilot. If it was successful, it wouldn't be a pilot all the time, but it at least allowed us to gather our learnings to be able to really start building a more, let's say, serious and validated product. And then as we went into our second year, so this was 2022, for that next recruitment cycle, we were able to sign on a few bigger customers, so central level universities and universities of applied sciences in the Netherlands. And that really got the ball rolling. When we had, a few big logos involved, we were able to grow very quickly within the Dutch market.
How did you find the step up in terms of selling to a larger organization or a higher up person? Was it still pretty much the same sales process? Were you still pitching pretty much the same sort of thing, or did you have to change it quite a lot?
We had to change it quite a lot, I would say, because it's very different building a process to find pilot customers than to find, regular customers. The pilot customer approach was very much kind of positioning as a research product. We've done all this research with students, we've done all this research with universities. This is our theory that if we do this and this and this, we better match students based on not just their academics but their whole profile, that they're going to be more likely to apply, be more confident in their choice, and have a benefit for the university in that sense as well, having better qualified candidates and better students in the end. But once you go to selling regular contracts, once you start going to the central level, again, like I said before, they don't have time to start to pilot like new ideas. So we had to very much position it as something much more validated, use data to support that what we'd already done, have a lot more of a confident kind of a lot more of a sales approach rather than a research approach. So yeah, it was quite different in that sense. But still, I think they also understood that we were still building, and actually most of the partners we had were very much like co-creation partnerships still to large extents as well. So yeah, at that time we really felt like the idea was taking off. I think within 2.5 years, we were working with more than half of all, let's say, higher education institutions in the Netherlands. So both research-focused universities, but also universities of applied sciences like business schools or more professionally oriented institutions. And well, the Dutch market isn't, endless. It's a relatively small study destinations in the number of options you have out here. There's about 45 institutions where you can study, and then not all of them you can even study in English. And our target audience was really international students. So at that time, we started to do some market research to try and expand abroad across the Dutch border. And then we knew that the big study destinations, the UK, Canada, Australia, the United States, that's where a lot of money was being spent. Where higher education is really an export product, much more even than the Netherlands. Still, it's a lot more competitive environment between universities. It's much more of a commercial business model as well, higher education. In the Netherlands, there's still a lot of, let's say, government money in institutions, or a lot of public investment, whereas in countries like the UK, they have to be commercially self-sustainable to a large part. So we thought that was interesting, and we wanted a piece of that, much bigger pie. So we started to, well, explore these opportunities, and we decided on, okay, the UK, it's closest, it's Europe. I had, from having studied in the UK, some personal connections that I could use to try and get a foot in the door. So we decided we wanted to expand there first, with some early success signing a couple of bigger university partners.
So far at this point, the actual product that you're delivering to the end user had been, very much focused on the Netherlands, which you know very well. In terms of building out the actual information that the student would get, how did you go about, building that out based upon, the UK and different UK universities and cities?
Yeah, so it was very different. In like the central idea and the way the algorithms were built. I should mention that we did move from that initial MVP, which was handwriting reports, to a more fully automated matchmaking platform where students could independently, put in their preferences, and then they would get a personalized university match report, what we would call it, with their top options, and it would be in real time, and it would be quite dynamic, personalized, much more visualized. So we really build it out into a platform in the meantime. But yeah, for the UK, while the central logic and idea and the problems we found were quite similar, both on the student side, studying internationally, whether it's in the UK or the Netherlands or Australia, the problems there are the same. It's about trying to make an informed choice. On the university side, there was a bit of a difference in, because of the market and the way the funding system is set up was so different. UK is also traditionally much more international market. They already started, years before the Netherlands, to attract international students. Also saw this as a commercially interesting model for them. So they're also much more mature in which partners and solutions they were working with to attract those students. So we had a bit more, let's say, competition to deal with, and yeah, mature market was a bit more challenging. But in terms of the product, we were able to use, actually, while it didn't look exactly the same, most of the key elements that we were trying to provide information on, such as university facilities, student reviews, like that information was actually available. We were plugging it in a little bit differently, and maybe not exactly, you'd have the exact same sources on each one, but largely it was copy pastable. So yeah, we had some initial success, as I mentioned. Then in 2020, so this was in 2023, then the UK government announced some policy changes where it would be there would be some restrictions introduced because the number of international students, especially post COVID, enrolling in the UK was growing quite a lot. Even though it was up until that point, it had also been a specific strategy for the UK to have X amount of international students to grow this. They very much were trying to grow the sector and grow the institutions like this, but I think also in answering to some sentiment, political sentiment on reducing net migration numbers and issues like that, eventually international students started to get into the same scope, and as a result of that, they started to they introduced some policy measures such as increasing the income requirements to be able to get a student visa. For postgraduate students, were no longer able to bring dependents. So, for example, family members if they wanted to come study abroad. Also, because of inflation and stuff like that, the costs of the study program started to increase a lot as well. So all of a sudden, international enrollment numbers from some key markets such as India, Nigeria, started to drop quite a lot, which put a lot of universities in a little bit of a financial crisis. So
Do you
yeah.
have any indication of what sort of drop that was? If the benchmark is 100% from students from somewhere like India,
Mhm.
how much do you think that dropped approximately?
It very much depends on the, let's say, demographic diversity of a university's strategic international recruitment. But universities that were very reliant on some of these key markets, there are some cases where they experienced a 50% drop in enrollments. So when you consider, an average university recruits, thousands of international students each year who are also contributing twice as much as domestic students get, in funding. Um, that's millions you're talking about that all of a sudden is, a drop in their revenue. So yeah, that's the sector was in a little bit of a crisis since then, and yeah, we also noticed it in our conversations that even though we had universities that were very interesting in working with us, they were postponing the decisions or not making the decision or deciding from a budget perspective it was just too risky and stick with their traditional existing recruitment channels, which is mostly study agents actually they're working with in different countries. So yeah, that was and around the same time in January of this year, the Netherlands introduced, so our domestic, much biggest market, introduced active international recruitment ban for the same reasons as they did in the UK. A lot of pressure from.
Interesting. Okay, okay. So the same political trends in both
Mhm.
countries.
Yeah.
Obviously, the UK has the whole context of Brexit and everything going on there, but interesting that that's also happened to such a strong degree in the Netherlands as well and had such a key impact on government policy.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's that the same tendencies are definitely playing here. Also, the anti-migration sentiment very very strong in the Netherlands. If you look at our last election, which was also won by a far right anti-immigrant party, then yeah, we when like the public debate started rising up, we were already a bit worried what it would mean, but we hadn't actually expected to translate into like restrictive policy. We'd expected universities to be able to maybe first have some, self-regulatory expectations, but no, actually on the 1st of January, they introduced an active international recruitment ban. So they basically said to universities, you cannot actively recruit international students anymore. Because of European policy, they have to accept and assess every application. They cannot discriminate between domestic and international student applications. That's a European framework around that. But so that the only way they could influence that was by at least limiting universities in their ability to attract international students. So yeah, that was quite disastrous in the
That's
Netherlands.
tough. Okay, so a question on that. So you mentioned that it was something that you knew was happening in the background. Do you remember the day or the moment when it became clear that this policy was going to come into force?
I would say that was the 1st of January when it wasn't quite a policy. Um, they it was just something they, like, how do you say, like an executive order almost.
Hmm.
Um, because the idea was that they had been working on a policy to at least be able to address the issue, to maybe give universities a bit more control over, because the problem isn't necessarily also the number of international students. Backdrop of this is also there's a big housing shortage in the Netherlands, which is definitely part of it, but also you'd find that in some courses there was, an overwhelming number of international student applications and in others not. Or, for example, in bachelor's, you have 25% international students, but in master programs, sometimes it's not even, more than 5%. So it's also a distribution problem. So what we had expected is, a well thought out policy would come eventually into place to start limiting. We had not expected for such a sort of knee jerk reaction to say, okay, no more, full stop. That's what we hadn't expected. So we were very surprised on the 1st of January. So also in terms of our internationalization, it went from a must have to from a nice to have to a must have if we wanted to survive. So we also realized that, the UK with its problems wasn't going to be enough to make up for the targets that we had in terms of growth and in terms of customers. So we decided we had heard from other, from our market research, from having conversations, that Australia was a very interesting market, where they were also seeing, also because of as an island nation, education is also very much, for at least at the time, a way to attract international talent to work in the local labor market. So we decided to look at that market more seriously, and decided to also start expanding to Australia. Also there, we had a few early successes, signing on some early visionary partners. And then around the summer of this year, Australia had, well, before that, they were also already talking about introducing more restrictive measures, reducing international student numbers. And then around the summer, they came out with quotas, so international student quotas. So also there, yeah, our projections immediately sort of fell through, and a lot of universities we had been talking to and that were interested had also said, well, we cannot make any decisions now, it's too risky. So yeah, all of a sudden, from a year ago where everything, we were growing at 2 universities per month, and um, we're very actually positive about our growth. Yeah, this year everything just took a nosedive essentially. So while we tried to pivot to the US in terms of international students is much less mature because they've always had such a big domestic market. But since the financial crisis of 2008, the birth rate also dropped quite a bit, which is translating now into much lower numbers of domestic students. So it was actually a really good opportunity and a good hole to jump into. But in the end, considering how long these conversations take to sign first customers, to get from, even a proposal to a signed contract, we had almost run out of runway at that point already. So it wasn't enough. So as of the 1st of August this year, we decided to actually liquidate the company and close it down, unfortunately.
A question on run rate and running out of cash. Were there any options to you, either through the accelerator program or through other means to raise an extra amount of cash, specifically to go after the US market?
So we tried, but around this time, I mean, the investment market or the VC market, whatever you want to call it, also took quite a dive. We came from a time from, beginning of this decade when we had, very low inflation, low economic growth, and very low interest rates. So it was a lot easier to raise investment, to raise funds. I think as we started to build out our company, that had started to take a much different turn, and it wasn't just about having a good pitch anymore and free money everywhere. So also those investors, when it because we were as an early stage company, the investors were looking at minimizing their risk and focusing more and more on later stage, more validated companies. So and so that's why we never really focused so much on fundraising. Also, we realized whatever time we spend on doing that is time we cannot spend on customers, on product innovation, because fundraising is almost a full-time job. If you want to raise a whole round together, whether that's like 500,000 or a couple of million, you'll need a lot of time to do that, to approach investors, to raise a round, to get them together, um, yeah, it's quite an investment, and that's time you then cannot spend on your actual business. And us being just the two of us, we felt like we couldn't really afford to lose that time. So, and yeah, when you need it, the investment, then you're usually too late. So yeah.
And were there any options for loan agreements, potentially with commercial banks or things like that?
No, not really, because we didn't really have any with traditional banks. We didn't really have any assets to back up our business. Um, it was still we were as a startup. It's usually funds that are very hard to get into because um, they're not willing to take those kind of risks, unless you give personal guarantees, or they'll always look for guarantees, and that's what we couldn't offer.
Makes sense. Okay, so
Yeah.
you've gotten to this point and you've decided to liquidate the business. How did you make the decision to liquidate the business, and then what does that look like in practice?
So, I mean, it wasn't a decision that came from one day to another. I think at the beginning of this year, we realized something had to change significantly. I think we were holding on to our existing pipeline for a long time because we did have a lot of universities both in the UK and Australia that were interested in. In some cases, they already had given a verbal agreement, but we were waiting on it to get signed or get through a legal department, something like that. So I would say maybe for too long we were holding on to that at least some of these have got to close. Maybe not as many as we expected, but at least some. But they just didn't, and just we couldn't get an answer. We also couldn't get a no. We just couldn't get a we couldn't get a yes or a no. The only thing we got was, well, it's still here, or we're waiting on this, or this person has to sign off. But I think if I look back, they were also just trying to probably buy time, or to not, make any decisions, or maybe too scared to make decisions, not knowing what would come next in terms of what they were able to do within new policy frameworks. So that made us hold on longer than we might have had we known, the outcome earlier, or had we known our the chances of actually closing contracts earlier. So I think around the beginning of July, when I started to send out emails to any potential customer that we had a negotiation with, or that we had a call with, to say, in order to be able to service the next recruitment cycle, we'll need an answer within the next 3 weeks in order to be able to, fulfill the obligations that we make in this contract in terms of what we
That is
deliver
a
to you.
very tough that's a very tough message to send customers, because in one sense completely rational, you have to communicate that to them, but then also by communicating that to them you look like a very risky proposition, and people are much less likely to buy a risky proposition. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it was tough because I also indeed didn't want to, yeah, make it look risky indeed. And well, there's a risk in putting pressure on a client to sign, to make a deal, right? Like no one wants to be put
Mm.
under pressure. But I realized, well, if I this can go on, it's been going on for months, and it will go on for more months if I don't get an answer. So it's also a good way to test, okay, how serious are they about this? Like, how big is the problem that we're actually trying to solve, or and if and probably I will lose some of them, but if I at least win some others, then I'll have an indication of how you know viable this market is still for us. So yeah, and then well, I think 90 all but one said, well, okay, then we'll have to wait it out till next year, and then I had my answer.
That's tough. If you could go back and speak to yourself then, or someone like you, what advice would you give specifically around this friendship co-founder relationship?
Yeah, I would probably advise not to go into business with a friend. Um, yeah, if I could make the decision again, I probably wouldn't. Um, if you insist on doing so, I think two things. I think because you might think because you have a friendship that you know each other. I would say you probably don't know each other as well as you think of, or you don't know each other in the ways that you probably should know each other. Because in a friendship is very different than like a co-founder relationship. It comes there's actually very little overlap in what comes with like qualities and personality traits and that are good for a friendship are translate very badly to what is good for a co-founder relationship. Mm, I think some of the red flag, and again, if you insist to, then at least maybe some red flags to look out for is in your friendship. Are you conflict avoidant, which many people are in a friendship, because often you can be more avoiding conflict with a friend than someone that is a little bit further away from you. Also, your inability to say no to things if you're too agreeable, that is also something that can be detrimental for a co-founder relationship, because in a co-founder relationship you have to be able to confront each other, to give and to take feedback in a very direct and honest way. I think also personal drama, personal issues, probably not that conducive to a good co-founder working relationship, or a good as a role as a manager of a certain area in your business, especially in a startup, because a startup will take 150% of your time and attention. If you have significant personal issues or drama to that you're facing in with your life, it will be a distraction, and it will be detrimental to your building process, to your growth in the end.
Interesting. And to flip that slightly, imagine, let's say, 10 years' time, you've got 10 million pounds worth of assets under management, and these two young entrepreneurial types come to you asking for a £250,000 investment in their startup. They're good friends and they're looking to go into business together. To what extent would the fact that they are friends impact your decision about whether or not to invest in their startup?
If I know this, I would definitely have a very like I would be extra focused on the qualities that I just mentioned. So I think having a very clear idea of how that friendship or that relationship functions in terms of how they deal with each other, how they understand each other, but also themselves within this relationship. I would be more critical than I would be with co-founder relationship that isn't also like a friendship.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And then thinking about yourself as an individual and your traits and your skills, particularly around conflict resolution, how do you think that's changed having had this experience?
I think I've also grown from that a lot. I was probably also in many ways conflict avoidant for a long time. I think that's what contributed to the situation that it sort of developed into. So yeah, I think I've learned to be more direct. It's not always. I mean, I think it's good to you can confront someone without making it personal. Like especially when you consider in a co-founder relationship, the thing you're both trying to serve is the success of your idea of your startup. if you take that as a central argument or the underpinning idea to everything you talk, like to the way you communicate, to the way you work together, and always reason from that interest first, I think there are actually ways to be able to talk about, the difficult stuff without making it personal, or without being, it's still going to be difficult, but it doesn't have to be as, hurtful or confrontational as you think it might be, when you always reason it back to that, essentially.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And now the actual liquidation process for someone that knows nothing about what that's like. What happens? What do you do? How does your weekly work schedule change when you're liquidating a company?
Um, it depends on, so we were able to go to liquidation. So there's liquidation is something else than bankruptcy. When you
Mm.
go bankrupt, I mean, the criteria for both is that you're essentially insolvent, right? You're not able to pay off your debt anymore, or you're not able to pay your salaries. So you're yeah, essentially your debt starts to outrise like what is coming into the company. But in a bankruptcy situation, you'll have assets in the company that are on paper at least worth something. So when you're unable to pay off your creditors, those assets will be liquidated to be able to pay at least part of the debt, whether that's to creditors or employees that weren't paid. Now, as a technology startup, we didn't really have assets to in on the balance sheet. We actually never registered the IP of our product, so technically it was, not worth anything in theory. And I think, and the only other assets we had in the company was, two laptops essentially. So what we decided is it would be, since there was not realistically going to be, any form of compensation possible, or any form of debt repayment, imaginable. We decided to, well, I decided to liquidate the assets, which in this case, I just meant I sold the the only assets in the company, which were laptops, off, which allowed to go into liquidation, which essentially is a procedure in which you say, okay, well, the company is insolvent, there are no assets to sell, there's no way to meet any of the creditors, to meet any of the debt obligations. So in the Netherlands, at least, it's actually very easy. You fill in a form, you send it to the Chamber of Commerce, you send your balance sheet and any financial data with it. And then actually from that day, technically your company is liquidated. And then it's up to you to inform your creditors to say, okay, well, this is the situation. The company was insolvent. We decided to liquidate it. Um, you can ask for more information at the Chamber of Commerce from the financial documents that you made available, on which they can see also, okay, the balance sheet, there's actually no assets, there's nothing to retrieve there. And if you're lucky, they will accept it, and then that's it. If you're not lucky, they might appeal against that, and then it will still go into bankruptcy, and then it will go to court, and the curator will get involved, and he will look at, okay, what can we sell to meet some of the creditors. And But it's a longer process than a liquidation, and it's a bit more frustrating because you still have to go through all that paperwork and administrative bureaucracy.
And then what did you do immediately after liquidation? How did you as an individual deal with this sudden massive change in your life?
Yeah, I was a bit lost in the beginning, because for the last 4 5 years, the Discov was, everything I was concentrating on. I didn't really have, other, you know, projects, or I think that's all I knew what to concentrate on. So all of a sudden, when that fell away, I was like, okay, what do I do now? Um, so I decided to actually, once I had all the administrative stuff done, once I had informed all the customers, all the creditors, I decided to book a trip to Sweden, to just sort of clear my head, be completely offline. I took a backpack and I went hiking for 10, 11 days through nature, which was for me a really good way to, well, sort of get away from it all, but also to be able to clear my head and to start making sense of what would be the next steps, what I would actually, what would be the new challenge that I wanted to take up on. Um, so yeah, I did that, and
It's a little bit like the film Into the Wild.
yeah, yeah, it did feel like that. I didn't have Eddie Vedder playing in my earphones, but apart from that, it was yeah, it was that's what I was going for, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, so I came back from that, and it actually also gave me new energy, a new motivation to start a new chapter. I'm not sure what that will look like, but for now, I did fall in love with international education, and I would like to actually stay within this sector. Working with students, working with universities is, it's I've really enjoyed it. So I think for now, probably not directly a new startup. Maybe going for something a bit more, well, landing on my feet again, being part of, in a commercial role, part of another exciting startup or scale up would be where I would hope to go next. And then maybe in the future, who knows what I will do then. I haven't given up on entrepreneurship entirely, but for now, that's the plan.
So, looking back and reflecting on the initial ideation process for a startup, what advice would you give someone trying to develop a startup idea?
So my first piece of advice would be to really fall in love with a problem and not the solution. Really find a problem that is deep and acute, and that, in a market that you're maybe somewhat familiar with, or it's something that you've experienced yourself, and really try to relentlessly learn about it. I think even in building the Discov, we only really started to understand the problem like way after we even started to build, like, or we had a first solution or an MVP of a product. So I think a lot of the mistakes that entrepreneurs make is that they might have a sense of the problem, but they are too focused on the solution or the technology, right? We've probably all been in a situation where you're in the pub and you think about, oh, there should be an app to like solve this problem, or we see this problem, we should have an AI to like solve that. But um, often why startups don't make it, if the idea makes it out of the pub at all, is that they spend too much time actually building on the solution before really understanding the problem. And I think one really important part of understanding a problem is to launch your product as soon as possible. There's this one quote, I can't remember who it's by, but it says, it goes like, if you're not completely embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've probably launched too late. And I really believe
I
in
think
that
it's
because
Reid Hoffman.
is it Reid Hoffman?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Reid Hoffman. Yeah, LinkedIn.
Yeah, exactly. And I fully believe in that, because often a lot of the trap that entrepreneurs will fall into is that they spend too much thinking and drawing out and investing into the problem and like perfecting it, and then they go and launch it into market and they find out actually no one needs this, or no one, or we actually don't understand our market well enough to solve anything with this. And so I think and also in the way you do research, why it's important to launch early is because you're going to learn something, but not that much, at least from my experience, by doing market research. Of course, surveys and problem interviews and even solution interviews can be very useful, but often you get or I didn't call this, but what is known as like the mom test. Like you go to your mom and you paint a pretty picture, and it's like, oh, what do you think? Oh, it's great, honey. Or even you might have a startup idea and you talk to your mom about it, and they'll always find it great. And this will probably be true for even friends and family that you talk to, but it will probably even be true for a lot of the potential customers that you talk to. If you say, oh, so if you have these problems, like, would this then solve your problem? You'll often get like, oh yeah, but it's not, people aren't always very honest, but it's not even that, or very transparent, but it's often that they might not even realize sometimes a problem is actually a symptom of another problem. Like not everyone really understands that much the problem that they're facing, or how acute that problem is. Or they might say, oh yeah, this is a big problem that we're having, but it's actually not big enough to actually spend or invest anything into solving, right? So it's also about how deep is the problem that you've uncovered. Is it a really a must have or a nice to have? Because I think your business will be more successful if you're solving a more chances of being successful if you're solving a must have problem than, let's say, a nice to have problem. And I think the launch early part is important because you'll probably learn most by having something, a solution that it might not do anything that you want it to in the beginning, but it gives you an actual much better way to start getting feedback. Because if you get users to actually start using it, this is when you'll really start to learn about the problem, but also about your customer. And this is where you can actually start an iterative process and an innovation process to start solving those customer problems. And at least if you fail, if you find out that, it doesn't work, or the customer doesn't actually really need this, or the problem just isn't big enough, or we don't understand it well enough, well, at least then you fail fast rather than you've invested a year of your time building a great solution or a great technology or a great platform or whatever it is, but that no one then actually needs. And then what often entrepreneurs then do, they've loved the product so much that they'll try and find customers for that product. And maybe it will give you some return, but it will take very long in that stage, in that kind of process, to start learning, or to finally make the decision that it's just not going to work out. And you could have used this time actually to come up with another idea, or to be much more successful in another problem, another market, or another way to solve it. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is the importance of the business model. I think a lot of people assume that, okay, once I have a problem that I know and I've built a solution for it, that's not what makes the business work. I think if you look at a lot of successful companies, they didn't just build a great product, or their innovation isn't necessarily building a great product, but actually in building a good business model that works, or innovating in the business model by not just looking at your customer segments and your value proposition, but also the way you deliver this, which partners that you work with, how you monetize the model, what constitutes the key activities, actually looking at all those elements. If you look at Airbnb, for example, they didn't what made them successful is not building a platform to find accommodation abroad. They were the disruptive idea, or the disruptive element of the Airbnb business model, is that they turned people's homes into hotel rooms. Like that's what made them different. Same with Uber. They didn't invent taxi driving, or just an app to order a taxi. Like that probably would have come at some point anyway. What they did that was disruptive was inventing a business model in which common people, like you and me, can become Uber drivers, and connecting that to, like, say, an existing demand of consumers. So focus on your business model, and building that up, not only, let's say, working on your product.
I like that. I like that. And now thinking about the business in terms of, more or less its core function: sales, marketing, the product, maybe operations broadly defined, and finance. Which areas did you outsource, and which did you do yourself in a kind of scrappy classic startup way?
Mm. Yeah, so I mean, building a startup, you're probably always going to be on a very limited budget. So you'll find that you're probably going to outsource as little as possible, especially in the beginning. But it is a really good question. I think it's one of the things that we needed to understand. Like, I think it was one of the things we needed to focus, or that took a lot of our time finding out or exploring, because on one hand, you don't, the very limited funds that you have, you want to put all of it like in your company. You want to make, smart budget decisions and use it, stretch it in the ways that you can. But on the other hand, you also don't want to waste your time or your talents on things that aren't, creating long-term value, or that to your business, or that are contributing to the long-term growth of your business. So it's really finding that balance between like just like grinding. Like I've spent a lot of time doing, working on things that you don't really, you know, eh, most other people could do as well. But at the same time, you also don't want to, spend that money, but that you can keep within the company. So I think finding the difference between, I think what in order to make this, to make that work, or to understand that best, is to have a very good understanding of, okay, what is part of the core processes of our business, what is like key, like what constitutes our key activities that we need to work on but also learn from in order to make this work, and what is stuff that needs to be done but isn't like a long-term sort of strategic value driver. Once you understand that well, I think you can sort of start mapping your time over it. If you have like a matrix in terms of, time consumption and value impact, where you want to be is in the top right quadrant, of both those things. And what you want to be able to outsource is going to be somewhere in the bottom left corner of that matrix. So, for example, what we didn't have in house was software developers. We actually contracted them, and okay, later it did become, an integral part of our business model, and it was very important. But in the beginning, when we didn't really even know what the product should look like, because we were still very much trying to understand and test and iterate based on market feedback, we're like, "Oh, why should we invest now into, an in-house developer if we're just trying to have something that we can, test with?" Eventually, of course, when we then had that feedback and we had a clear idea of our business model and how it should work and how we should deliver it, if we had the funds, I would have definitely hired an in-house developer. But that's one example of something you don't necessarily need from the beginning.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And and
I would
thinking
caveat
broadly,
that with, unless you have a deeply technological product, it's a little bit different, I would say. But otherwise, not necessarily a core asset or a core competence you need to have from day one in the company.
yeah, that makes sense. I think a lot of people outside of the startup or technology space would be surprised how many tech products are sold before the platform is built in any meaningful way,
Mm.
even years into the company's existence. Whereas in the startup space, you'd be like, "Oh, that's actually very common, and that's often the best way of doing things." Is there anything you would have done differently to ensure your company's success, looking back with the benefit of hindsight?
Yes, definitely. While it might have been, I mean, I've already caveated with like, I'm not sure if I would have told myself this then, if there was any reasonable way to know back then. But if I, for example, if I were able to write my internationalization strategy again, because I think why we didn't make it is, you can call it bad luck, but we did expand to the wrong markets. Essentially, why we had to close down is because these policy changes were happening in all of our key markets, and all of them were becoming, almost not viable for us as a startup with limited financial buffers to be able to survive in. So I think partly, yes, it is bad luck. I think the other part, maybe, no, maybe if we had been a bit more critical of markets that we wanted to expand into, the Dutch market is vastly different than the UK or the Australia market. So if we'd actually had maybe done more research looking into if we know we have a validated business model and we have, a product market fit in the Netherlands, instead of looking at, oh, what are the biggest markets we could expand into, maybe we should have looked at what are markets like the Netherlands that we know, that we validated, that we have a product market fit in, that resemble similar variables, similar characteristics than the Dutch market. Then we might have not looked at the UK and Australia. We might have looked at markets like Sweden or Denmark or France, which are smaller study destinations but growing internationally. Smaller institutions, much less mature markets, much less dependent on study agents, which use like a no pay, no cure no pay sort of commission structure, which is very prevalent in big markets like the UK and Australia. I think if we'd made that exercise better, I think we might have made smarter decisions in our internationalization strategy. I think the
Interesting. So you're
other,
saying that in a question there. So you're saying that in theory or potentially it is better to go for a smaller but growing pie versus a massive pie that is in risk of declining due to outside events.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's yeah, and in this case, the variables or the characteristics could have been smaller and bigger. In another case, it could have been that the market was big or growing very fast, and that the characteristics of the customer and the market and the different elements of the business model would have looked similar. But yeah, in this case, that would have for in our case that would have been a good conclusion to draw. Yeah, and of course, part of you I think it's important to have as an entrepreneur in growing a business. It is important to be hungry. It is important to go for big pies, to follow the money, things like that. Yes, they are true, but in terms of de-risking your business model, which is essentially what you're doing until you're profitable, or until you're able to or until the point where you really have, let's say, a validated repeatable business model. Until then, you should probably focus on de-risking and making decisions like that, looking at, okay, expansion markets, new customer segments. This might be a better decision to stick to what you know and look for growth within that, than to try and make too big of a leap into the wonderland.
Interesting. Interesting. And then on
Um,
that, thinking of just
mhm.
thinking about it from the perspective of an entrepreneur, what were some of the key resources that you consumed that helped you on your journey?
So I would say those are the key resources in terms of let's say like learning resources. The biggest one I would say was it's a book called The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. You might be familiar with it, but actually it's this one. Highly
Oh,
recommended.
excellent. Strong. I love that. I love that.
Highly recommended to like anyone starting wanting to start a business. I think it is the most useful, very practical guide manual, and I think the underlying sort of theory below it makes a lot of sense. I think the central idea to the book is you're as a new business, if you're trying to develop a new idea, right, that doesn't already exist, or there isn't necessarily a business like it, you're always operating under circumstances of extreme uncertainty. Like very little, you might have some idea, but assume that you know very little about your market, about your product, about different elements of your business model, and that what you're trying to do is to and all you have is essentially assumptions. And the book is very much about it has a validated learning approach. So you develop assumptions about your market, about your product, about your value proposition, about your the key activities, about your pricing model, all of those things. And all you're trying to do is to de-risk those assumptions. So you try to learn about these assumptions to try and get a more validated form of your business model. And it's a very scientific method, I would say. It's very much based on experiment-based learning. So you design experiments around your assumptions that you want to test, and that can be based on market feedback, that can be based on user behavior with your product, that can be based on like a flash sale, or whatever data you're looking for to de-risk or to validate assumptions. You develop experiments to try and understand that, and like that you try to build up your business model. So I think I like it because it allows anyone to be an entrepreneur. You can be an entrepreneur because you have this naturally in you. Maybe you have this natural mindset or this natural talent to think in that way, or a certain acumen that comes with it. But I think the lean startup allows, I think the idea is that you have a process that anyone can use to start and try and build a business in a way that um, is based on, well, validated learning, and is based on a methodology that you can implement in any market, in any type of business, in any idea. The other one would be, I think I mentioned it a few times before, but where I see innovation to be in business models, not necessarily in products, or maybe more importantly in business models than products. So the business model canvas, you might be familiar with it. We used to have the traditional business plan, but I don't think a business plan is very good for a startup, because it actually assumes that you have a plan, and you can only make a plan when you know what your goals are, and what you need to make that plan work. But the business model canvas is much more simple, and the focus is much more on iteration and assumption testing. So you have all the key elements of your business, and you start mapping your assumptions on it. So it keeps you focused on those elements that you need to validate, and avoids bogging down on, like, a lot of details that in the end will not be as important for the success or the growth or the validation of the business model. And it's also just much more time efficient in that sense. So that's more on the, let's say, theory, like, let's say, business modeling and process building side. I think another one, this is probably will be more useful once you get well, start forming some sort of an organization. But Traction by Gino Wickman, it's a very good manual. It's called the Entrepreneurial Operating System, and it brings a lot of structure and discipline to your organization, helps to align teams to improve decision making, and create a more high performing organization. That would be the key resources that I've used.
Cool. I like that. I like that. I also, when you're talking about the business model canvas, it reminded me of a quote which I shared recently on social media, which is the Dwight Eisenhower quote, which is, "In the art of battle, I found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable." Around the idea that you never really know what's going to happen with your plan, but the art of thinking about it and thinking about what are all the different moving parts is the most useful thing, which is how I understood your description of the business canvas.
I think that's exactly it. Yeah, I think it's exactly the same idea.
And now, thinking about people, did you have any key mentors on this journey?
Yeah, I would say mostly two. One, I mean, there have been a lot of people involved in this process, advising us on, you know, um, from a market perspective, from a process building perspective, from just an entrepreneurship perspective. So a credit to, like, all of them. I would say the most important for me is one. His name is Rene Roskamp. He was part of the startup studio that we started the venture in, and he was yeah, what he would say a process driver. So he was our mentor and very much helped us on the whole, let's say, ideation, business modeling, learning how to actually, a lot of what I just mentioned. So the lean startup approach, the using the business model canvas, value proposition canvas, actually using tools and processes to implement, to be able to actually pursue innovation and start developing a business. We Almost all of what I learned from him. He's really someone with like an engineer's brain, like very logical, systematic, very focused on problem solving. So he really taught us how to use these tools, but also really helped us keep focus on what mattered. And I think the way he did that was just by asking the right questions. He wasn't someone that would say you should do like this or this or this. He would just have a natural instinct for asking exactly those questions, which makes you understand what you should focus on, or how to understand what is a priority to focus on and stuff like that. So very, very grateful from what I learned from him. And then the other would be, so that's the more, let's say, the engineer's brain. Then I would say my brother, he's 5 years older than me. He's started and failed a few ventures. He's like maybe like the counterweight to that. He has more of that sort of instinctual business acumen that's less scientific, or less, let's say, theory based, but much more, what I learned from him was like how to also think big, how to also, take risks, or how to, trust your instincts. So yeah, I think how to develop my general business acumen in that sense. So both have been extremely useful, because theory, accounts for a lot, but sometimes you just have to also make gut decisions, or take risks, or do something, a little different, to get to where you want to be.
Cool. I like that. I really like both the balance between the kind of engineer scientist and visionary risk taker artist kind of aspect. That's really cool. Really cool.
Mm.
And now thinking about yourself right now, and this is broad life. What advice would you give yourself 10 years ago?
I think one piece of advice I would give myself. So 10 years ago, I'm now 31. So I would have been 21. So 21, I would have been at uni. So I think when I was at uni, I was always thinking about like what I should be doing, or what is my passion, or like what is, my true calling. I think in my entire life, I decided to take like broad educational programs, whether it was in IB or at university, because I never wanted to choose, I wanted to keep my options open. Um, and then, so also when I finished, I was very much like, oh, what is the direction that I should actually take? And I think I spent too much time and had too much anxiety about figuring out what that was. Looking back on the journey that I took now, I think just try stuff out, and, just get out there and try stuff out, I think would be the advice, because I think that's the only way to really figure out. I think one, there's not one true calling. I think there can be many, many versions of callings, and many ways to, put your passion into something without it being one thing. And two, I think the only thing you're really going to be found out what you're good at, or what you like doing, is to just to try stuff out. Yeah, and I think when you're young, you have time. I mean, I'm 31. I have to make, the same decision now that I needed to 10 years ago, finding a job, to getting onto a new challenge. So yeah, I think that would be my advice. Yeah.
Cool. I really like that. And now thinking about yourself in 10 years' time, when you're 41, what will that version of yourself give you advice about now?
Well, what I would hope that advice is is like, don't worry too much. It will all work out in the end, because that will mean that I got there in the end. Um,
Like that, like that. Yeah, yeah. Sit back. It's gonna work out.
yeah, it's gonna be fine. Yeah. Well, so yeah, I think also because the last, I think post like liquidating the company, it's also been very much like, okay, what's next? Like what? I think from even from just sharing what my story with my network, I made like a LinkedIn post on a little bit about like what had happened and the decision I made and why I made that decision. There was so much sympathy that came from that, and so many reactions, which in itself led to so many opportunities, and people connecting with me, and even job opportunities saying within my sector of. And that's been, I guess it was a good confirmation for me after having gone through a period of failure, not necessarily personal failure that I'm blaming myself in any, but just like failure. It still feels like failure, right? That it was a good confirmation that, okay, we did mean, like, what we did meant something to customers, to people, like to students, to. And the other thing is, people do see that, they must identify certain capacities and skills that came from going through that process that makes me want to work with them. So, or makes them want to work with me rather. So, yeah, I'd say trust that things will work out one way or another.
I really like that. I really like that particularly because it highlights, you know, particularly with this sort of startup, or I felt this myself with the Kickstarter, is you very much succeed or fail very publicly. And so when you are as public about the failure aspect as you are about the success aspect, and being public about that failure aspect has a positive benefit in terms of the conversations it starts, the feedback that you get. That is a really nice thing. I think that's a really uh, like excellent quality of the universe that could be the case, as it were.
Definitely, yeah.
Cool. And then final question: what is your favorite quotation right now, and why?
My favorite quotation, maybe I should change it. But it's been like, at least from building a startup, this has been my favorite quotation for quite a while. It's actually from Elon Musk, and I don't think even when he gives it, he says it's actually from a friend of his. But they're talking about. I think the question he gets asked is like, "Is it fun starting a company, or is it fun being an entrepreneur?" And he says, "Well, starting a company is like staring into the abyss and eating glass. The staring into the abyss part is you're essentially always constantly facing like the extermination of your company, like and most startups do, right? Over 90% of, or maybe even 99% of startups don't make it. um and so you're constantly sort of staring into this like valley of death, because you're always so close. Essentially what you're doing the whole time is buying time to learn, buying time to, to learn more, to validate, your business model in the way that you can make it, viable and successful. And the eating glass part is, you as the founder or CEO or whatever, you always need to work on the company's hardest and like worst problems. So they're not always typically they're actually not the ones you want to be working on. They're not like the most fun to work on, but they're the most necessary, and you need to deal with them. Which is not to This is not to discourage anyone to start a company. I think it can be very sort of gratifying as well. But somehow it just felt so familiar reading that in my own journey building a company. So yeah.
Oh, I like that. Super interesting note to end on. Cool. Really appreciate your time, man. I think this has been a really cool chat. I think there are so many like key life lessons pulled out of it. I think particularly that co-founder relationship. I think particularly looking back and advice for someone at the start of the journey, and then even some of these resources that you pulled out. Really, really interesting. Really appreciate the chat, man. Thanks.
Thanks for having
Cool.
me.